After their marriage and Anne's coronation, the couple would go on a tour of England. Signs that the English population was growing to warm to Anne were evident in 1383 when she visited a hospital in Norwich. The hospital would display 252 black eagles on a ceiling within the hospital in her honor. Also, Anne would have a great effect on English fashion and is thought to have brought into fashion the long-horned headdress and long thin shoes as an acceptable style of women. She was also responsible for the introduction of the side saddle for women who liked horse riding. Queen Anne would eventually win over the hearts of English population as an advocate and mediator. As queen and wife, Anne would be able to use her position to influence many of her husband's actions. She would first use her influence during the Peasants' Revolt during 1381. When Richard had the Lord Mayor of London, John Northampton, sentenced to death, Anne would intercede and have Northampton's sentence changed to life imprisonment. In 1387, another of Richard's uncles, Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, would march on London with an army of 40,000 men. Thomas and other nobles were unhappy with Richard's rule and arrested several of Richard's men, including his tutor and guardian, Sir Richard Burleigh. Anne was begged on her knees for 3 hours to Thomas to spare Burleigh's life, but Thomas refused but ensured that Burleigh did not receive a traitor's death. In 1388, Richard, at the age of 22, would now be able to fully govern his own affairs. His power was consolidated the following year with the return of one of his favorite uncles, John of Gaunt, who had traveled back from one of his Spanish expedition. Anne would spend much of her and her husband's time with John at his castle in Leicester. And Anne in return would host John of Gaunt at her palace in Eltham at Christmas. Anne though would go further in her mediation for the people in 1392. She would publicly beg in front of her husband on her knees after Richard had arrested city officials who had refused him a loan. Richard would rescind his decision and ask his wife to sit beside him, giving her assurance of his pardon. On the 7th June 1394, Anne would be taken ill at Sheen Palace. Later that day, she would pass away, most likely from the plague. Richard's grief was so big that he would order the palace to be demolished. Then Richard vowed for 1 year that he would only enter churches in which he had spent time with Anne for 1 whole year. Richard would plan an extravagant funeral for his wife. As Anne was the daughter of an emperor, he decreed that honors for his wife's funeral should be greater than his grandmother, Philippa of Hainault. The funeral would be delayed for a whole 2 months whilst Richard made the preparations. On the 3rd of August 1394, Anne's body would be carried from her palace at Eltham to Westminster Abbey via St. Paul's Cathedral to a service conducted by the Archbishop of Arundel. Anne would be laid to rest in a magnificent tomb prepared by her husband. Richard would join her 6 years later, after he had been deposed and murdered by his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. From their 12 years of marriage, there would be lasting legacy from Richard and Anne in the form of an heir. It is always believed that the couple who were so in love with each other did have a normal sex life. But the reason behind them being unable to produce a child has always been shrouded in mystery. Was Richard impotent or was Anne unable to conceive? These questions have and will never been answered, leaving a lasting tragedy over the end of the marriage.